All right. This morning, welcome. We're continuing our study this morning on the 10 ways to guard our heart. And we've built this whole lesson around the Proverb 4:23, which says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. So that's the crux of what we're studying this quarter. And so far this quarter, we've talked about four things. So we've talked about being an encourager. We talked about being forgiving. We've talked about being truthful. And last week we talked about being pure. And I don't know if anybody had a chance to do their homework and did a heart audit, but that was pretty painful. Just to be frank, not really. It was good. I think it's good for all of us sometimes to look at that. So, and then this morning, we're going to talk about being content, which is always our favorite subject, right? So we think about being content this morning. And, you know, it's interesting. As I've studied this lesson this week, actually, you know, I don't know. I actually feel better about this week than I did before I started studying, which is interesting. A lot of times when I study these things, it ends up being a little more deep and I have more questions about it. But, you know, when you think about being content, a lot of times this is the verse that people bring up or come to. It's Philippians 4:11. It's actually the second part of the verse. I have it in the easy to read version here this morning because I really like what it says. It says, I have learned to be satisfied. Most versions use the term content with what I have and with whatever happens. So I really like that terminology. A lot of the other translations use different terminology, but to me, this really speaks more to us today than it does some of the other translations. As I was thinking about this week and studying, I did a lot of reading. And one of the books that I ran across is called The Jewel of Christian Contentment. It's by a guy named Jeremiah Burrow. It was written back in the 1600s, maybe 1700s. And it was a series of sermons that he did. And they made them into a book. And it's when you Google it or start looking through things, it comes up almost every time as one of the really good books about contentment, especially for Christians. And so one of the things that I realized as I was reading this book is that he goes into great detail talking about what contentment is not. Because he says that a lot of times we're confused by what contentment is. We automatically think about things that maybe it's not, right? Rather than thinking about what it really is. So this morning, for the first little part here, we're going to talk about a couple things that he says or he talks about that contentment is not. And I think that will help us as we transition to thinking about being content. So the first thing that contentment is not is it's not pretending that everything is okay. That was one for me this week that was interesting because I think that sometimes I think about contentment being that way. I think, well, if I'm content when something goes wrong or something's bad happens, I should just be like, okay, well, that's fine, right? I should be content with it, right? But when you think about being through your week, you think about being mad or sad, or I was going to say glad, but that's too much of a rhyme. So happy about things, right? When you hear those things, sometimes we think, well, I shouldn't be that way, right? I shouldn't be mad or really more of the sad part. I think on the happy side, we're fine most of the time, but I really see it mostly with sadness. You think about this when we're kids, right? Something happens, we fall. What do our parents say? It's going to be okay. It's okay. It's okay. Don't cry. Don't cry. It's okay. It's okay. So we think about that as being content. But when you think about Jesus, like in John 11:35, Jesus said, the Bible says Jesus wept. And he wept for his friend Lazarus that had died. And he wept even though he knew he was going to heal him. So it's kind of interesting there to me. He had this emotion. Jesus had this emotion that he let out in this way. And I think we should think about that, right? It's not, we don't have to not show our emotion. So the contentment does not deny pain or hardship, right? It actually should be able, we should be able to get through it a little better, right? Because of being content. The second thing that he talks about is that contentment is not laziness or a lack of ambition. You know, I've taught lessons on contentment before, spoke with people about contentment before. A lot of times when people get a little testy about contentment, they'll have some comment like, well, what am I supposed to do? Just not ever do anything, and that's certainly not the case, right? Contentment is not about being lazy or lack of ambition. I mean, there's plenty of examples of this, but here are two that in 2 Thessalonians 3:10 and 11, this is the verse where Paul says, if they don't work, let them eat. Now, we have a tendency sometimes to think about that as a rule. My personal opinion is that's more of a principle than it is a rule. It's not a big judgmental thing, right, about people. It's more of just a principle there. And then in Proverbs 6 through 11, he talks about, this is the writer of Proverbs, talks about the ants, talks about how ants work. And they're diligent and they work and they don't think about their circumstances. They just keep doing their thing, right? They're ants. They're also spoke of in Proverbs 30 by Agur, not Solomon, but Agur. In Proverbs 30, he talks about ants. And so you think about contentment in this laziness thought process. If we're content, it should create this desire in us to do our work diligently, right? That doesn't mean that as we work, we're not thinking about other opportunities or maybe even looking for other opportunities necessarily, right? But the contentment that we have with the situation that we're in or the work that we're in provides that, right? It provides that desire to do our work diligently. So I'll stop for a second. Anybody got any thoughts about these first two? So contentment is also not indifference. I think a lot of times this is the biggest one that I see is people just say, whatever, right? I mean, if I'm going to I'll just be content with whatever the situation is. I'm not going to do anything about it. There could be some thoughts about giving up there as a wording. You look in Romans 12:9 through 13, Paul talks there a whole lot about how we're supposed to interact with one another. We're supposed to be hospitable. There's just a lot of things there that he talks about that shows us that we're not supposed to be indifferent about things, right? That is not a sign of contentment. Contentment never means that I don't care. And I think sometimes we get that mixed up, right? I mean, the facts are, if you don't care, you don't care, right? It really doesn't have much to do with being content. The fourth thing here is lowering expectations. Contentment doesn't do that. Now, there's a fine line here, as we'll talk about this a little later, but there's a fine line here between lowering expectations and having too lofty of expectations or not having any expectations, right? You think about the verse in Colossians 3:23, Paul says here, do your work heartily, right? And do it as if you were doing it for the Lord. So there are obviously expectations of us as workers and things that we do for Christ and in our Christian lives that we shouldn't lower. But that doesn't mean that we're not content, right? And so contentment doesn't mean we stop trying to improve our lives or serve others. I think that last part's really true, right? Thinking about serving others. I know Spencer's spoken of this before in some of his sermons about how as we get a little older, sometimes we become what we say is content, right? And we kind of have done our jobs, right? And we kind of think about resting a little bit, which is all fine and well, but I don't think that needs to be a thought process about being content. And then finally, and probably the biggest one, right? So this is the one for me this week that was, I wouldn't call it necessarily difficult. It was just the one that I had the most trouble with because we think about contentment. Sometimes I think we think about it as being happy, right? And happiness is really what is based on our circumstances, right? I mean, you again used the example earlier about through our week. There are circumstances that arise through our week that create happiness or sadness, right? Or anger or whatever emotion you'd like to put in there. But that's really not contentment. If we're content and we're not worried about the circumstance, we're just okay in the situation, which is hard. It was really difficult for me this week. I go back to Philippians 4:11, where Paul says he's learned to be satisfied with what I have and with whatever happens. That last part, with whatever happens, is so hard, right? You just think about that from the reality. You know, we talk about this in this class all the time. These subjects that we're talking about, especially this quarter, are so much easier to talk about than they are to do and execute sometimes. Because when you're in the moment and something happens, it's just hard to not want it to end or want it to not be there. It's really difficult. You think about, yeah.
So how in the same heart can there be contentment, but I also would have a preference for something else? Or, like your first one was like, that doesn't mean you don't have discouragements or whatever. You can be discouraged and content at the same time. How is that?
I've actually thought about that a lot this week. I don't know that I came up with a really good answer. To me, it kind of comes down to this statement again. It's content is being okay where you are at the moment, right? So it's a kind of a goofy example, but it's just an example that kept coming back to me. So I have Achilles tendonitis in my left heel, and I hate it. I mean, it is painful. Sometimes I have to wear a boot. If I don't do things just right, it'll flare up, and I wish it wasn't there, right? So I'm not content with that, right? With it being there, but I'm okay with it being there because I know I can't do anything about it to solve it, but I have things that I can do to help it, right? So I'm doing exercises to help it. I do certain things to help it.
That verse to me brings a whole new light when you think about 2 Corinthians 11:23-30, where Paul lists all the stuff he had been through. And you look at that list of, I've been beaten with rods, I've been stoned, thrice I suffered shipwreck, night a day in the deep, and all the stuff that he's been through. And then to read that by the same man.
I agree.
Whatever happened.
Yep.
Wow.
Yeah, I agree.
Wow.
And so here's what, and I don't know if this makes any sense, but I wish that my Achilles tendonitis would go away. And I actually know that it's probably going to get worse as I get older, right? But I'm okay with that right now. It doesn't mean that I don't want to do something about it or that I don't like it or I'm discouraged about it some days, because I am. But I think, okay, I'm going to deal with it when it gets worse, But for today, I'm going to be content that it's not like today. It's great. It's a great day, right? So I don't know if that makes sense, but it comes back to a little bit of, I think the discouragement maybe sometimes is less about contentment and more about how we should react to things.
So the alternative would be you're just disgruntled all the time.
Correct. Or the alternative might be, I promise, I see y'all, I promise. Or the alternative might be that I don't do anything about it. Right.
Okay.
Right. So I just sit around and say, well, there's nothing I can do about it. I'm content maybe. That to me wouldn't be content. That would really be me, what was the word?
Settling.
Yeah, settling or maybe just saying I just give up.
Giving up.
It's indifference, right, to the situation. I don't know. It's tough. Michaela, where are you? There you are.
I think to help with the whole fact of being content, even when you're being discouraged, is to remind yourself that you're important enough for the kingdom that Satan is trying to hurt you.
Yeah, which we're going to talk about that in a minute. Today, the things that make this hard are 100% Satan. 100%. I have no doubt in my mind. Miss Mary Lee, you were next.
What I was thinking, when we start facing that lack of contentment because of something we're enduring, if we can stop and put it in perspective, just like Paul did, he learned to be content because he knew where those thorns in the flesh were coming from. They came from Satan. Anything that he can send to distract us from what we are supposed to be doing for the Lord.
Yes, I agree 100%. Lisa?
I think Paul's contentment and our contentment should come from knowing what we have to look forward to. It makes everything else obsolete. Yes, it's hard at times. Paul suffered probably way worse than we ever will. But he knew he had been this terrible person and God had forgiven him and he had heaven to look forward to. And Christ died for us no matter what. As long as, we live for him.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that 100%. I think the challenge of that, the difficulty of that is that we as human beings, no matter what our age is, really kind of see that as something far off, right? Sometimes. So it's a little more difficult for us to get our mind wrapped around that, to me, than it is what we're going to talk about in a little bit, which should be our contentment, is that God is enough, right? Not necessarily heaven is enough, God is enough. And that's something that's very difficult sometimes. Bernie, do you have a comment?
Contentment, a lot of times to me comes back to our situation that we live in. We're blessed in this country. And I think of the parable of the rich man and bigger and better. And I wonder, including myself, how much are we content when we're constantly thinking about bigger and better? And a lot of that has to do with the consumer-based society that we live in. But that doesn't make it right to feel that way. And so should we really be working at more, being content, and look at the biblical examples of how we can help others and in the even an economic situation, rather than if we're comfortable, that we, is that contentment just to keep thinking the way we're thinking, or should we be thinking a little bit differently?
Well, I mean, I certainly think we should be thinking differently, for sure. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think where the fine line is with that is, how does that impact you from the heart standpoint? So like, can a person be extremely generous, right? And still, I'm making this up, collect baseball cards? Because I mean, baseball cards are expensive. I mean, I say that, right? I'm not talking about pennies, right? I mean, I think you can be, right? I think if the difference in my mind is if you buy, again, 15 baseball cards in a week and you can't put anything in the contribution on Sunday morning, then I think we're talking about a little different situation there, right? But should I not buy baseball cards because I should give all of that baseball card money to the poor? I don't think that's what God intends at all, right? I think it's the heart situation. There's how do I think about being generous, right? How do I think about that?
I kind of think about, like when Jesus sent his disciples out, told them not to let the dust settle, like do what they can do. And then if it takes, great. If it doesn't, then.
Sure. I mean, and
Go
that's
on, you
about
did
the
your part.
gospel. That's right. Yeah, it's a good point, Wiley.
So contentment is a state of mind.
Well, that's what I thought before I started.
But you've explained it,
We
right?
ain't got to that yet. We're not talking about what it's not. So,
But you take your planet, your Achilles tendonitis, right? You said you can be indifferent about it. Like, I've got that problem on my foot, nothing I can do about it. And you can let it kind of control your thoughts. You can kind of let it control that, right? You can, like Spencer said, be grumbling. He's like, man, I've got this. And can't do anything about it, but man, it makes me mad. Or you can be, you know what? I have this Achilles tendonitis. That's okay, because I have other things that I can do. And it's a state of mind. That's what it is.
that's what I thought too, Wiley. That's what I thought. That's what I thought too, Wiley. But I'm telling you, Wiley and I are both J's on the personality scale, right? So when you think about things like that, for he and I, it's about controlling your mind, right? But I'm just telling you, you get some situations that's not the case. My Achilles tendonitis is a whole lot different, right, than someone else's situation sometimes, right? It's not just as simple as saying, I'm going to gut through this, right? Or I'm going to change my mindset. One of the biggest, you just said it a minute ago, one of the biggest words in this that we're going to talk about in a minute ago is the third word. I have learned. It is not automatic, right? Before I studied this lesson, I would have thought just like Wiley, it's just a state of mind. You just make your mind up and that's what you do. Well, I don't have to learn that. Right? I mean, I mean, I can learn that, right? But that's really not what I'm talking about when I say that I'm thinking, you know, you just pull your bootstraps up, big guy, right? That's kind of the way I think about it. Okay.
Well, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but I always thought that you could be content based on your circumstances. So like before this year, I generally would go through times where I would have food for up to 3 weeks. I've lived in places without water, AC. And so now when I look back at what I have now, that generally makes me content because I know what it's like to live without those things.
Yeah. So just kind of like Paul, right? Yeah. Yeah. So you can be content in your circumstances, but your contentment itself should not be based on circumstances. Right. Yes, sir. You're good. Your face is red. This is not good. I'm just saying. Where are we going?
Oh, what she just described is exactly what is up there on board. I have learned, your turn to learn. Like when I said what I said, I wasn't saying, hey, come on, man up, pull your bootstraps up, get out.
Well, I kind of was.
Well, hey, but I wasn't, right? But through our life experiences, that's where we learn things. The things that has been put in our path to either side rail us or to give us better. Those things are combined experiences that give us what we know. And that's where we learn those things, right? And so when something like that on your foot comes up, dude, I imagine you've had some pretty hard times in pretty different ways in your life, right? And you get down and your mind is, grumbling or indifferent or just in the gutter. But you learn now that it's like, okay, that's okay if I had this because of those things that you had. She said it fantastically well. That's what you learn now.
Yeah, I agree. So it comes back to kind of contentment in my mind is being okay where you are, right? At the moment, right? Any other comments? So let's look at this a little bit closer with Paul here. In 1 Corinthians or Philippians 4:10-13, it says, I have great joy in the Lord because now at last you have again expressed your concern for me. Now I know that you were concerned before, but no opportunity to do anything. 11, I am not saying this because I am in need. So Paul wasn't asking for help here, for I have learned to be content in any circumstance. I have experienced times of need, times of abundance, and in every circumstance I have learned the secret of contentment. Whether I go satisfied or hungry, have plenty or nothing, I am able to do all things through the one who strengthens me. So again, his secret here is Christ, right? It's Jesus, it's God. That's the secret to contentment. Knowing that God is bigger than anything we have. It doesn't mean he's going to solve it all the time or the way we want him to, but he's bigger than anything we have. So you think about what Paul said here, back to the ERV, it's why I really like this one, is I've learned, right, to be satisfied with what I have and with whatever happens. Paul's not talking here about not trying to change those circumstances necessarily. He's just content in the moment because he knows God is bigger than this. I think it's interesting. He says contentment is learned. It's satisfied with what I have and satisfied with whatever happens. Question that I had this week was, can we, right? So back to we're talking about this, right? Can we execute it? Right? Can we be content? Can we learn? Yes, we can. Can we be satisfied with what we have? Yes, we can. Can we stay satisfied with whatever happens? Can we? If so, how? And when you look at this verse in Hebrews, I'm using the New American Standard because I really like the word character. Make sure your character is free from the love of money. Be content with what you have. For he has said, I will never desert you, nor will I ever abandon you. So the thing that I saw about this verse with a little study help here was, in this verse, God's reason for contentment isn't you have enough and don't need any more. He doesn't say that, right? What does he say the contentment is? You have me. Be content in the circumstance you're in because you have me, right? I will never desert you, nor will I ever abandon you. Again, as I thought about this lesson this week, it's so difficult to think about that. This is, I was trying to think about this as I studied this week of how many times do I actually think about God in a week? I mean, I think we all as Christians would love to think we think about him a lot, but it would be interesting to know as we go about our day, do we really think about that, right? And so to me, I think that's part of our issue sometimes is that we encounter these circumstances, if you will, and we kind of think about ways to solve them on our own. We kind of think about how we're going to take care of it ourselves. And I think all that's fine, except for the fact that we probably don't think about God in those scenarios very much. I think it's just our nature too, by the way. I don't know that there's a whole lot that we can do about it except for pray and try to do better, being intentional about it. So God's reason for contentment isn't you have enough, it's you have me. Now, when we start thinking about this next portion of the lesson, which is be content, which is really where we're headed, is the question is, do you know someone that just seems to be content with life? Right? They just seem to be content. How would you describe them? Right? I think when I thought about this week, I really thought about my grandparents. Okay, so I had two great sets of grandparents. And when I thought about who was content, they were the first people that came to my mind, right? And here's what I thought about that. They were thankful, right? People who are content. They were thankful for things, right? They were generous. And when we think about generous, I think sometimes we get all hung up, right, about money. And look, that's important, right? But I think when you really think about someone you know that's at peace, they're generous with just about everything, right? Time, money, advice, maybe, whatever it is, right? They're peaceful. I know, when you're around your grandparents, you're not around them all the time. And my grandparents weren't perfect, right? They weren't perfect people. But when I think about them, I think about them being peaceful. My two grandparents, my mom's mom and dad, they sat in their recliners and watched Lawrence Welk, right? And were so content with that. They would just be like, man, aren't they good? And I'm sitting there thinking, this is terrible. And stupid bubbles, right? Right? They enjoy the simple things, like my grandfather would take me trout fishing. I've told you all these stories 100 times, it didn't make any difference if we caught 3 or caught 10, right? He just enjoyed being out there, right? You think about, they rarely complain. They celebrate others. They're satisfied with now, right? They think about now more than they do other things. And then they're comfortable with themselves, which I think is such an interesting thing of me when I thought about this, right? I think about my dad's mom. She, I think I've told you a story before, she died and had never had running water in her house, never had a toilet in her house, right? And she was not embarrassed by that one bit, right? I mean, when you went to see her, she didn't make any excuses for that. She drew water out of a cistern. She didn't care, right? She was very comfortable with that kind of thing. I would say that for most of us these days, that would not be the case, right? So you just think about that content heart. Contentment guards our hearts from comparison. It guards our hearts from envy, from greed. And then this last one, which is this chronic dissatisfaction. This is one of the things this week that helped me. Okay. Because when I think about myself sometimes, and sometimes when I'm dissatisfied about things, it's more acute, right? I'm dissatisfied with my choices for lunch, right? It's just an acute dissatisfaction. It's not a chronic dissatisfaction. I'm not thinking about it all the time. It's not something that's growing. And so I think that's our goal. Like for me this week, I actually felt a little better about it. I'm like, okay, so this chronic situation is much different, right? It's at the heart level. It's not at the surface level about things that we as Americans, right? I mean, we think they're heart things, but they're really surface things most of the time, right? And so when you think about this, my question is, what causes us to be discontent? I'm gonna stop on this one. What causes us to be discontent or have chronic discontentment?
Impatient.
Impatience would be one. Greed would be one, maybe. Greed, not maybe. Greed would be one. What's that? Envy, which we'll talk about in a minute. So I did a little research this week. Okay. So the top 4 causes of discontentment for Americans. Okay. Anybody want to guess what number 1 is?
Anxiety.
What?
Anxiety.
It is anxiety, but it's over something.
Money.
Yes. Financial anxiety from debt, retirement, right? And comparing lifestyles to others. That's number one. Right. And by the way, I didn't make this up. There's like 6 different polls that were combined here for this. Number 2, comparison through social media. I bet you we would have gotten that one eventually, right? Because we see things, and when we see things on social media, they're never the bad things, right? They're always the good things, right? It's the best part of the trip, I assure you. It's not the seasickness, right? It's never that, right? Number 3 was loneliness and weak relationships. You know, you think, well, how does that come into discontent? Well, I don't know, but it does, and it's there, right? That was the number 4 thing that people had. The first 2 were the biggest ones to me. And number 4 was constant stress and busyness, which, you know, those last 2 you could think about, like a weak relationship could be caused by discontentment, right? Because maybe the relationship that you have with someone, you see what is missing instead of what's there, right? I mean, it really becomes this difference in attitude about how you look at things, right? So one of the strongest findings across all these studies I looked at is that gratitude predicts contentment much more than income, education, or success. People who intentionally practice gratitude report higher life satisfaction regardless of circumstance. Do you guys think we believe this?
I think we see it. I don't think.
That's what I'm saying. Right? You think people really believe this? When I was typing this out, I was actually thinking to myself, I wonder how many people in the room are going to roll their eyes at me. Right? That's what I was thinking. Because it's like, this is one of those things that sounds like Hallmark, right? And we're just like, right? Slough it off, maybe, you know? Right. But anyway, it's just true, right? Yeah.
All that seems to be, there's an ideal in our head of where we should be, right? Like there's this, and none of us have quite arrived. So where does the ideal come from?
Well, let's talk about that because it's next, right? So it's one of these. What makes this so hard, right? So when you think about what makes being content so hard, first thing is comparison. We've already talked about this a little bit. Somebody else has it. We think we should have it or we want it, right? It's just, and it may not be in an envious way necessarily. I think, quite frankly, I would think it's less about envy and it's more about just, I want it, right? It's just, somebody else has it, they deserve it, I should get it, right? You think about just salary scales, right? Things like that. It kind of makes that happen. Materialism. So I think all of us would admit this. We think things will make us happy, right? We've all done this, right? Every single one of us has done this, and it's true. But this one's one, Spencer, that I think you might have been talking about. So the expectations, right? Are we realistic? So Spencer used the word ideal, and I think that's a great word. I think we have ideals about how things should go and about how things are going to be. We think about it from the future standpoint, and it makes it really difficult when reality comes to bear, right? Because we don't know. We don't know much except for that horn keeps going off. That's what. But we don't.
Somebody's gonna have a dead bag.
They are. So we don't know, but I think that's what happens. And I'm telling you, I don't know this. This one's one that I struggle with this week is how do we keep that from happening? I mean, you can't think about going on a vacation somewhere and not have in your heart, this is going to be great. I kind of know what's going to happen and I want to see these things. And then you get there, maybe it's not as grand as you thought, I don't know. But I think at some level, it's back to this intentional contentment thought process. It's when you get there, it's more like, well, that was my ideal, right? This is really how it is, but I'm still here, right? And I'm still blessed to be here.
How many times is that reality? And we go, well,
Every day.
Every Christmas, it's
tough,
at
man.
some point in time, you're like, I'm falling for an illusion and I've got to quit doing that, right?
Well, and I think some of that's a little bit of self-protection too, right? If you think about it. I mean, I know, like for myself, there are times when I try to dumb down my expectations of something so I'm not disappointed, right? And I think, that's probably just me trying to control things, right? Which I probably shouldn't do, right? Ingratitude. This is one that I thought was interesting. A lot of different examples we could use, but we focus on what's missing instead of what's there. The whole glass is half full, half empty kind of thing. And then finally, which probably is one of the worst, this one's one for me, right? Worry. You're concerned about the what ifs, right? Or the future, right? I spend I've told y'all this before. I spend a lot of my mind time in the future, thinking about how things are gonna happen, mostly with business, but it just, it filters over to your life too, right? You can't help for it too. Yes, okay.
Watching other like Christian.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, anytime you have an example of someone that's supposed to be a good example and they end up not being a good example, Michaela, that could obviously be very disappointing, right? So no doubt about that. So as we finish up here, let's think about a couple of key takeaways. We have contentment is learned, right? So I think that's something for me this week that was very beneficial to me because I have a general tendency to think it should just happen, right? I should be strong enough. I should have strong enough mind power to just make it happen. And that's not always the case, right? Contentment is something that has to be worked on and it has to be learned. It's not just something we're going to automatically have. Contentment isn't based on circumstances. I think that's a tough one, right? Because circumstances can lead to contentment, right? Because you get through them. But your contentment isn't really based on that. And comparison is often the enemy of contentment. Now, real quick, because I forgot something. So this was the part that I was going to tell you guys. This, to me, this list right here is 100% Satan. 100%. This is how Satan wants to undermine us, in my opinion, as Christians. He does not want us to be content with God. Right? He does not. He wants us to think we can do it on our own.
Because if we are, then he has no power over us.
Exactly. Right? No power over us.
We're happy where we're at, so why would we go anywhere?
Correct. And we can work on that journey, right? But it's a situation where if that doesn't come about, we're still okay. That to me is the biggest thought about this is if let's just use an example as a job. If you were in a job and you wanted to move up, right? But that moving up never happened. May not be your fault. It just never happened. Can you stay content in the spot you're at, even though you're trying? That's what I think this whole thing comes down to, right? Is can you stay content where you are and be okay with that? Or after that happens 2 or 3 times, you tell yourself, God's not helping me. What's all this about? I mean, I've done my part. I've worked hard, but God's not favoring me in that situation. Well, maybe he actually is, right? Because when you move up in things, right, things don't always go. It's back to that ideal thing, right? Sometimes it doesn't work that way. Yeah.
You blew my mind 20 minutes ago, though. I've got to go back to the Philippians 4 section where you talked about 10 through 13, where he says, I can do all things through Christ which strengthens me. How many hundreds of sermons have we heard in our lives over that scripture?
Yeah.
But has anybody during those sermons for you, because I can tell you, for me, it's never happened, never once connected it to the idea that he was talking about contentment?
Sure.
I think about the shipwrecks, the beatings, that's what I think he's talking about when he says, I can do all things through Christ, which strengthens me. But it puts a whole new slant on things when he says that verse was because he was talking about just being content.
God's enough.
Wow.
Right? God's enough. That's the thing, right? Jeff, come in.
I just want to say that sometimes when you bid on stuff or you try to move up and you don't, it might be God looking after you said, you don't need that.
Exactly. Or you don't want that, or it may have some other negative effect right along the way. I agree 100%. But it's very difficult in the moment, right? Very, very difficult. Very difficult in the moment. So a closing thought here is contentment isn't this, if you don't get anything else, maybe this is it, right? Contentment is not found in having more. Okay. So that's not where we find our contentment. It is found in trusting God with what we already have, right? So we have it. We trust that God's given us that for a reason. And as we move along, when those things don't go the way we think, we still can put in our mind, this is God, right? This is God's providence, or however you'd like to put it. Michaela, do you have a comment?
I was just, one thing I've always hated when people talk about contentment is they always use it as an excuse of you have to be content in every situation you're at. But like if you're in like a toxic environment, then you should be content being.
Right. Contentment doesn't mean you can't work on the situation. That's a big deal, right? So this is the weekly challenge this week. Reflect. One, when you're tempted, when are you tempted the most to compare yourself to others, right? When is that temptation? You pray, ask God to help you trust him and celebrate his blessings. I think that's a big deal. Like for me, that's a big deal. I've been trying to think about that more, right? And in practice, be intentionally content each day this week. And all that means is just tell yourself, I'm okay where I am, right? Doesn't mean I don't want to move a little, but I'm okay where I'm at if I don't move, right? So next week, Chris has got us. He's going to do be humble. And then y'all have a great week, right?
We are. And we're gonna
Comment.
Delta.